And we're going to start off with the idea of going organic. So typically, when people argue against going organic and they say, you know, that really is just a market trend, the food isn't that much better, they'll tend to quote studies saying that the nutrient density maybe isn't that much different than a non-organic food. And so what we're going to talk about is that that's only a very small portion of the story, at least in my opinion. More importantly, we need to talk about safety concerns related to what is actually on those non-organic foods. And so what is there? Well, it can no longer be disputed that persistent and elevated levels of pesticides are found in our water and food system. The best study that I could find to really demonstrate this was one done by the CDC. This was a few years ago now, but they looked at over 9,000 people and found that every single one of them had detectable levels of these persistent organic pollutants. So every single person, right? They're not saying just one particular pesticide or insecticide or chemical. They're looking at hundreds of different types, but everyone had some level of one of them or a few of them. What's even worse is that mothers, or expectant mothers now, so pregnant women, have shown that environmental contaminants and pesticides are found in these mothers, and there is a correlation with the higher amounts leading to lower birth weight and lower birth size. So is correlation causation? No, but it is something to start getting us thinking. Excuse me. So the biggest problem here is that, okay, we've identified that these pollutants are in our environment. Does that really mean that they're causing harm, right? A lot of people will say, well, I've never eaten organic and I feel healthy, I feel fine, right? So why would I spend the extra money? The first thing is that it's very difficult to study these harmful effects, right? Everyone wants that randomized control trial or double-blind study like the parachute one. It comes down to a synergy of compounds. So as I alluded to, hundreds of different chemicals, literally hundreds of chemicals that you can be exposed to, and that is over a very, very long time, right? We're talking about a lifetime. So what are the effects of these chronic low doses as opposed to just studying, one compound that you're getting 1,000 times higher dose? So when they do a study, right, in animals and they say, we want to see if this compound is safe, they may look and say, we're going to give it a super high dose and see what effects it has on the body. The outcome may be that, this is bad for the nervous system, but that's not at a dose that we're ever going to see in real life, right? So they say, well, it's still safe then because we're just doing such a small amount. But when you add all of those up, who's to say that there's not a synergistic and compounding effect there? Also, it's very difficult to test when we talk about storage issues. So we typically look at urine metabolites, so the breakdown products of these pesticides or insecticides, talk about blood levels, but if they are fat soluble, and in many cases they are, Dr. Herkel spoke about dioxins at one point and how they are stored in fat and therefore have very long-term health implications associated with them. Just doing a blood test or a urine test doesn't truly suffice or let us know what that body burden is. So that's the first problem, is that we can't truly study them. Even more so, people will then say, okay, well, let's admit that maybe there is an issue, there's a health concern related to these pesticides or to these chemicals. Does eating organic food truly decrease your exposure? And so this is a really great study and a really great visual that shows, yes, organic food does reduce your exposure. So this is in 23 children over a 2-week time period. And what they did was they collected urine twice a day of this metabolite, so this breakdown product in the urine, basically of a very common pesticide. And you can see here that in the conventional diet, so they're eating non-organic food, they do have traceable amounts. So something is going through their system, right? Their system's trying to break down something and excrete it. As soon as they switch over, that first day there, for a 5-day period, eating an organic diet, yes, they are having a much lower body burden or body load of these toxic chemicals. Reintroduction just reaffirms that this conventional diet will bring these chemicals back into play. So eating organic does reduce the exposure, bare minimum. When we get into the argument about how nutrient dense are these organic foods, people will say, okay, well, is it actually better? Because there's been some confusion in the literature, some studies finding that, most of the vitamins, most of the minerals, there's no difference between the two. But there are a lot of studies coming out that are more positive, saying, no, organic food does have these very clear-cut benefits. A lot of them tend to do with magnesium levels. So I know you guys have heard enough about magnesium today and the benefits of it. But isn't that interesting that magnesium in organic food tends to be much higher, significantly higher, as opposed to a non-organic food? So perhaps that's playing into this whole epidemic of magnesium deficiency that we're seeing. Other nutrients, vitamin C and iron are two of the big ones. And then really we'll talk about like flavonoids and carotenoids and a lot of these other compounds that aren't considered necessarily a vitamin or a nutrient, or sorry, a vitamin or a mineral, but they are very important as an antioxidant. So the main benefits then, again, with this whole section, what we're trying to do is, if a patient comes to you and they're just asking this question, very straightforward, what does the evidence say, or should I be considering going organic? Main benefits, you're certainly reducing your exposure to these likely harmful pesticides. Maybe not going to have an impact, that direct or that quick acting, but you are reducing exposure. Typically, the research points to the idea that you're getting more nutrients, you are being more environmentally responsible, so by decreasing the pesticide load in the environment, in the food, in the water, in different animal ecosystems. And finally, this really relates to this first point, but eating organic is more protective against genetic damage. And so the best example of this, or the reason I have this up here, is that there are now studies coming out that are looking at the effect that pesticides have on not the genetics or per se the outcome of that animal itself, but more so looking at generationally what effects it's having on maybe their grandchildren, the children after that. And they're actually finding that pesticide exposure in utero, in animals, will lead to the 3rd or 4th generation having increased susceptibility to chronic disease. So that's the only thing they changed in the study, right? That generation 1 or 2, they're about the same. But when you get to 3 and 4, that's where all those things start coming into play. So epigenetics, the idea that you have your set genetic code, but environment really does play a role as far as turning on or turning off those genes. So that's a really important point there. So that's kind of the crash course on whether or not it makes sense to eat organic, or is it just a trend. If someone is asking you and they're saying, okay, but the biggest problem is that it's expensive, right? Is it really feasible to do? What's a really easy way to incorporate this into their lifestyle or to recommend to them? This is from a website or an organization called Environmental Working Group, so ewg.org. They come out with this list every year, and that is the Shopper's Guide to Pesticides, where they label the dirty dozen, they call them. So the top most pesticide-laden foods. These are basically the ones that, yes, it does make a lot more sense to spend that extra, $2 to get organic apples, organic strawberries, because this is increasing your risk of pesticide exposure the most. Whereas this list over here, the clean dozen, perhaps that's where you save those few bucks and say, you know what, with something like, well, banana's not on this one, but I know it has been on other lists. Eating organic bananas, typically the pesticide is not getting through that really thick peel. So at least you can be very selective and say, these are the ones that make the most sense. And that's a very easy place to start. Okay?